Beyond 3D. Welcome back tonight to another edition of Beyond 3D, coming to you live from the RPP studios on the Mornington Peninsula, Victoria, Australia, 98.7 or 98.3 RPP FM. Tonight, Beyond 3D would like to present an updated interview with Dr. Stephen Greer in regards to his unacknowledged project. So sit back, relax, turn off the lights, and indulge in tonight's edition of Beyond 3D. Beyond 3D.
What the Sirius film is about is putting in enough information into the public, not to the UFO subculture per se, but to the general public, that they would begin to look into all of these issues: higher consciousness, disclosure, the fact that we're being visited by advanced civilizations from elsewhere, and also the technologies that go with it. And I think the big problem most people have had in high circles and here in this city, and perhaps in Canberra as well, is if this is true, why would it be secret? And I think that to answer that is one of the things we tried to do with the film Sirius. And of course, many people have known it for the Atacama Humanoid, I'll get into in a moment. And maybe you can put up on your screen the reports from Stanford and elsewhere that are coming in about this small humanoid creature we found in Chile. But our big objective was to posit that if we're not alone in the universe and we're being visited and they've gotten here, the paradigm in physics and science and technology that would allow for that, shall we say, trans-dimensional transfer from one point in space to another at multiples of the speed of light, opens up an entirely new area of discovery, not only in science and technology and energy, but also in consciousness and other dimensions, because you're not going to go from here to another star system in anything less than multiples of the speed of light, certainly 100 to 1,000 times the speed of light. And if you're doing that, you are in another whole paradigm of understanding. Now, what I would say to people is that Dr. Walter Russell and the Swanano Institute up near my farm in Virginia, who was mentoring Nikola Tesla 100 years ago about all these issues, talked about these same things in his book called The Universal One. So there's really nothing new under the sun. My perspective on this is that our society is about 100 years retarded, if I might use that word broadly, delayed, thwarted from our natural evolutionary course because a bunch of petro-Nazis and kleptocrats and obsessive-compulsive control freaks have decided to keep this information secret, not because they're afraid people are going to hurl themselves into Sydney Harbor, that because there are ETs out there. You know, there's about 2/3 of the public now believe there's intelligent life in the universe. I think it's mainly because in October of 1954, I'll give you this date, and it was provided to me by the third highest ranking scientist at the Naval Research Labs here in Washington. We basically mastered gravity control, the ability to cause mass cancellation and do lifter systems, so-called anti-gravity. It's not a correct term, but that was October 1954. Now, I was not a twinkle in my father's eye at that point, and yet here we are 50-some years later, almost 60 years later, burning coal, which, of course, Australia is exporting in great quantities to China. It gets 80% of their electricity from coal. And we're still using internal combustion engines for the cars, which is, of course, what Mercedes invented in the late 1800s. We're still using aircraft that burn fossil fuels, much like the Wright brothers in 1908 or jet engines in 1930s. And even our rockets are not significantly changed from what Wernher von Braun had in 1942 or 3. So when you look at all of this, you have to ask, really, has there been no developments in energy, propulsion, all of these issues in almost 100 years? The answer is obviously, of course there have been developments, but they have been viciously suppressed. And this is not a conspiracy theory. I really abhor the terms paranormal and conspiracy theories. Paranormal is just someone else's normal world. And it's not a theory. It's a fact. I mean, one of the things that we tried to focus on in the film Sirius, which everyone can see online if they'd like to at SiriusDisclosure.com. You may be able to put that up on your screen and show people the trailer at some point. Those technologies that had become a threat to the national security state as it's perceived in the macroeconomic order, who really runs the world, which is 200 or 300 large corporations and families, also not a conspiracy theory, fact. And if you brought out something that would fit on your table, that would run your house or fit in the hood of your car and run your vehicle, where you wouldn't have to plug it in, like the Tesla S, then you would have a completely different society. Because suddenly, power literally and figuratively would go back to the people. And we'd have a truly democratic world at that point, wouldn't we? Because we wouldn't all be dependent on this thin supply line of oil tankers from the Middle East and coal barges from Australia to China and what have you. And I think this is really the crux of the problem. And it really informs not only the secrecy, but what you referred to in your introduction, the shall I say, nexus of disinformation that is associated with this subject. Because if you take the Wilbur Smith memo seriously, the one that was, of course, released accidentally in the 70s in Canada, referring to the 1951 document from Canada, top secret document, where Wilbur Smith, who was a scientist with the government of Canada, stated in a report through inquiries he'd made through chain of command in the United States that there was, in fact, a concerted effort headed up by Dr. Vannevar Bush, who, no relation to W., but who headed up the Manhattan Project to study the modus operandi, I'm quoting, the means of energy propulsion of the ET craft that were recovered in New Mexico in the 1940s. Now, this is a legitimate document, but what's interesting about this document, and this is 1951, he says that it's the most secret project in the history of the United States, exceeding the secrecy of the development of the hydrogen bomb. Now, remember, we did not detonate the first H-bomb, which is, of course, thermonuclear as a fusion instead of fission bomb, which is what we dropped on Hiroshima, until 1952. So here is an admission that 60-some years ago, there were projects studying the energy systems and propulsion systems, some of which have actually been deployed to your outback out near Pine Gap and Alice Springs that are all underground, by the way. And what you find is that we're running around, the 7 billion of us, cannibalizing the planet, living in a state of complete ignorance on this for the most part. So when I started the Disclosure Project, it was really an accident. And let me explain what I mean by that. Most people don't know this story. My real love, because before I was a medical doctor, I was a teacher of meditation and the Sanskrit pujas. And I had some amazing experiences as a young man, a boy, in consciousness and then with contact with extraterrestrial civilizations and people. And what I really wanted to do was what we have done, and that's form teams of people all over the world that can learn the science of consciousness, go into remote viewing capabilities, and make peaceful contact with these civilizations, no matter what you think they're here for. In other words, in a truly diplomatic way to say, if they're here, we need to reach out to them in sort of a détente and a sort of a very enlightened way. And to the people who love to have something to fear and hate, I call it, we're going from racism and tribal wars and city-state wars to great power struggles in the Cold War and global terrorism. And as Werner von Braun predicted, you mentioned Carol Rosin, the next thing they want to play is the evil aliens that we have to organize around to fight.
Beyond 3D.
Now, whether or not, no one can prove a negative. It's axiomatic that you cannot prove a negative. I can't prove there aren't anything of anything. However, I will say I've been all over the world, and I see no areas of the world yet conquered by any marauding alien civilizations. I do see a lot of disinformation put out there that's designed to scare the hell out of people. Now, why would that be done? It's the same reason that Hitler made the Jews look like caricatures. It's the same reason why we had to do the same thing to the Muslim people. It's the same reason why right-wing nut jobs are still doing that to gay people or to women or what have you. And so, we're trading racism and misogyny and all kinds of other phobias and what have you for what I'm going to coin a term, exophobia, the hatred and fear of ETs. I think this is a very big mistake. I think we're getting way ahead of ourselves. And what we really need to say is, why don't we set up diplomatic, enlightened folks, and I've talked to the Honorable Paul Hellyer in Canada about this because he agrees completely, go out there and try to see what kind of contact we can have. Because if we can make contact that is peaceful or at least useful, that would be better than the contact being made by black projects using electromagnetic pulse systems targeting ET craft trying to provoke a Gulf of Tonkin incident. Now, of course, those of you who don't know the history of the Vietnam War, that's when we staged an attack on our own vessels in the Gulf of Tonkin so that the political establishment and public in the United States would support the expansion of the Vietnam War. This is not a conspiracy theory. That's a matter of provable historical fact. Anyone can look it up. So here we have, years later, a similar agenda, mainly advanced, I think, unfortunately, by certain elements of the UFO subculture, but also by people in Hollywood making all kinds of terrifying films. And what we're trying to say is, before we go off hysterical, the sky is falling, now let's put weapons in space, and these ETs are good because they look like they're from Sweden, and these ETs are bad because they don't, and all the usual canards and racist nonsense. Why don't we take a step back and say, why don't we go out there and try to meet them? Why don't we have some kind of protocol for encounter that's peaceful? And that's what we really wanted to start, and did start in 1990, it's almost 23 years now, which was the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence. That was the great love I had. As a result of that, and most people don't know this, we had 4 ET craft vectored in on a beach in Florida. It's in the film Sirius very briefly, sort of a comical bit of video, not very good quality. But there were about 40 or 50 people there, including an Air Force colonel and 2 Air Force pilots, who saw these objects just materialize in the sky and move towards us, using these protocols in consciousness and coherent thought, which we now have an iPhone app and an Android app that anyone can get and put on their phone, and you can practice this. It's really quite easy. There are now about 2,000 teams around the world doing this, and I think this is the most exciting part of what we're doing that most people don't know about and haven't heard about. But for me, it becomes something where if you have enough people doing this, you create a morphogenic field where we begin to turn the impulse of the world away from this fearsome future of apocalyptic interplanetary war, which is what the military-industrial complex would like to have happen, and unfortunately about half of the New Age and UFO community as well. And I think what we want to do is turn it back around and say, if we're really going to start a new era, which I think we're in, we're a good 100 years into a new era, the hallmark of that is universal peace. Because you cannot have world peace without universal peace. If we're going to trade the conflicts on Earth for fighting between star systems, it might make Scientologists happy. It might make Lockheed Martin happy. I don't think it's really the future we want. It's not the future I want for my children and grandchildren. So I think there's another way of approaching it. Now, on the way to doing that, the success of these early encounters in Gulf Breeze, in Belgium, everyone remembers the late 80s, early 90s, the big craft that we're seeing all over Belgium. We went there with a team. I was there, and a massive craft came over us. We began to realize not only do these protocols work, but the ETs are eager to try to have some degree of contact. It may not be as open as people would like, but some degree of contact with humans if we approach it in the correct ethical and philosophical paradigm. In other words, not militaristically, and not xenophobically, and not with prejudice and fear. So that's what we've been trying to do. And I think people have had amazing experiences, not only in consciousness, but with objects and beings that they've seen. And if you go to SiriusDisclosure.com and click around, you're going to see this one being that was floating in Joshua Tree outside our circle after a meditation that first appeared as a spherical object. And we went, oh my God. And then we heard these voices that you couldn't see anything, speaking in a language no one could understand, about 4 or 5 voices. Most people heard a female voice. I heard a male voice. And a member of our team, Raven, just connected to them in consciousness and took a photograph with a single lens reflex 35 millimeter camera. And in that was an amazing image of this being. And people go, what is that? I said, well, if it's actually ET, it's transdimensional. If it's transdimensional, they can appear and disappear in an instant in ways that are quite enigmatic. They can also fully materialize, but that's riskier given the fact that we're trying to shoot them down all the time. And this is the other point that brought me out of my medical career to try to work on this problem, is that back around 1990, between 94 and 98, I met with a number of people in the defense establishment in the United States who informed me that we had developed very advanced so-called scalar longitudinal electromagnetic weapon systems that were being used to target ET vehicles around the Earth and even in near-Earth orbit. It may be that the SDS-48 footage is a firing of one of these type of weapon systems and an object coming into the atmosphere, those of you familiar with it. And this alarmed me a great deal. I mean, back then I didn't really believe that we had those capabilities. Now I know we do, because I've heard it from too many separate corroborating people in the defense establishment and in the national laboratories here in the United States. And so this made me feel that it was even more important that the people who you would think would be supervising projects like at the National Security Agency and the CIA and Department of Defense should know about this. So out of this initial contact grew what, if you get the documents from the Clinton Library, that was called Project Starlight. And Project Starlight was the predecessor to the Disclosure Project, where I was asked to come up to Washington, brief various people, including the CIA director for the president and a number of other senior people here, about the problem. And I guess, I'm a guy in my 30s at that point, and I think, well, if we give them the evidence and show them what the problem is, they'll do the right thing. I never had anything to do with Washington. I was an emergency doctor taking care of shootings and stabbings and car wrecks and all the fun things we have here in America and elsewhere. But the truth is, I really thought that people in the Clinton administration, certain people that were friendly to what we were doing at the Pentagon and in the Congress, would take this up and fix the problem. Well, from 1993 until 1998, we discovered everyone wants to know, nobody wants to do. Let me explain what I mean by that. Everyone wants to know about this stuff, and I mean everyone. I have no problems sitting with a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee or people who are at the Pentagon who are admirals and generals. Very few people are read into, which is military speak, briefed into these compartments, these super secret compartments dealing with UFOs, ETs, anti-gravity, etc. And so they want to know, but when you ask them, will you help us fix this? They go, oh no, this is past my pay grade, it's too controversial, I'll be called Senator Moonbeam and ridiculed. And so that's when we decided in the late 90s to launch the Global Disclosure Project. But it was really kicking and screaming. What I really love is sitting out under the stars, meditating, making contact, teaching people about the fact that the entire cosmos is a conscious quantum hologram folded within us, and we can get in touch with that aspect of non-local conscious mind and see anywhere and contact any place. And that to me is what's really exciting. This other stuff, I mean, even as momentous as it may be to a lot of people who first learn of it, is all things that should have been resolved before I was born. But that's too bad. It wasn't fixed, and so it's left to us now to fix it. I think all of us between the ages of puberty and senility, which is hopefully everyone in your audience, has an obligation to try to fix this problem. It's been kicked down the road for so many years, and I think that we really are running out of time to fix it. So disclosure is key, and the disclosure is not going to happen from any government, in all my opinion. It's going to happen by we the people.
Beyond 3D.
Back in the 1990s, there was a CIA director, former CIA director named Bill Colby. Bill Colby reached out to us because he wanted to hand off to my team because he thought I guess this is what the actor Burl Ives said about me. I'm sane enough to get it done, but crazy enough to attempt it. And I'm an emergency doctor, so I don't scare easily. Basically, I had the head of Army intelligence threaten me once. I said, screw you. I said, you get in my way, I've got stuff on you, you'll be in Leavenworth. But I'm nice until I'm not nice, and anyone who knows me will tell you, you're going to get run over. But here's the problem. When you have someone like Bill Colby, who was a CIA director and who was inside Majestic, not all CIA directors have been, but he came up through the ranks. He was getting old. He knew that this was a criminal conspiracy that was destroying the planet because the technologies and the information that would completely transform the planet, heal the Earth, Gaia, get us out of this impoverished situation, and also importantly, and this was said to me, get us out of the Mideast, which is nothing but a disaster. Because when people say the Mideast has so many of our vital national security interests, that's code for oil. What's in the Middle East besides oil? Except Israel. But Israel has about 200 or 300 thermonuclear weapons. I assure you, lived there for 3 years. They can take care of themselves if they have an existential threat, and it will not be pretty. However, we're really there because of oil. And then the question becomes, why are we on oil? Because the petrodollar system and the whole Bretton Woods arrangement and the way the world runs is on a metered linear system. And this is no different from when J.P. Morgan told Nikola Tesla, if I can't put a meter on it, you're not going to have it, and it isn't going to come out. And he was talking about an electric vehicle that had an antenna on it that did run on, quote, free energy. And that was in the 20s. So now you look at someone like Bill Colby, former CIA director. He's getting close to the end of his ride. I guess he was in his 70s, pushing 80. And he reached out, one of his best friends was a full bird colonel who reached out to my board and said, look, Bill Colby has access to this technology and wants to get you one of these devices and about $50 million in money so that you can securely get it out and just push it out to the world. And I said, I'm willing to do it. So the week that a member of my board was going to meet with Bill Colby, they found him floating down the Potomac River here, made to look like an accident, but it wasn't. Now remember, this was during the Clinton administration, period. And that, just like the JFK assassination, although most people didn't know that this was an assassination, even his son recently wrote a book thinking it was suicide, although the wife disputed that. Basically, they made an example that they would eat one of their own, and they did. And I felt terrible about it, and this was around the time my best friend, Sherry Adamak, got breast cancer. I got multiple metastatic malignant melanomas, and she and I were both supposed to die in 1997. She died in early 1998. And there were all these horrible things going on. And I thought to myself, well, this is how they send a message to people. They basically will send a message through making an example out of people, and Jack Kennedy was one. There are others, though, that most people don't know about, and Bill Colby was another. And what I tell people is that you can't let these sort of fascistic, kleptocratic sociopaths, really psychopaths in my opinion, dominate the planet. And if we do, shame on us. And I think this is the big challenge of our generation, is that are we finally going to come together as a people and say, we've had enough? we're going to come together and make contact that's peaceful with these ET civilizations. We're going to disclose all the information we can to the fullest extent that we can, even though we have no funding, no office, and no staff. A lot of people think we have some office building filled with people. It's all volunteers. And, and by the way, the people who kvetch about things, I'm giving up over $500,000 US a year as an emergency doctor, chairman of the department, to do this for nada. So get over it. And thirdly, the bigger problem is the fear factor from the leadership. So I think that a lot of people don't understand that these shots fired across the bow, which actually hit some people like Kennedy and Colby and others. I'll give you another name, Lord Mountbatten, an allegedly IRA bomb. Well known in the intelligence community that Lord Mountbatten had a UFO land on his estate. Timothy Good's book, Above Top Secret, describes this. He also had gotten to know Dorothy Kilgallen, who was talking about the Roswell event and the retrieval of these ET craft. And Lord Mountbatten was beginning to make a lot of noise about it because, as you know, he's very, very close to the Queen and Prince Philip, and he was a father figure, was a father figure for Prince Charles. And of course, Prince Charles and Prince Philip are very interested in this subject. And so basically, that was another one that got a little too noisy out there. And so I think that leadership consists of courage at this time. And courage doesn't mean that you have no fear. It means, which I've certainly experienced, fear, but it means that you have to have a spiritual center where you pass through the fear. Unfortunately, our political class and even the generals and the senior bureaucrats and governments have become very soft. And it doesn't take much to scare them out of the fray. And so I think that we, the people, to use a Jeffersonian term, are going to have to become the inspiration and the courage and the force to make this change happen. I'm very skeptical it's going to come from the centers of power. And I always was. A lot of people think, oh, well, he felt that this was going to happen from the Congress. I said, no. We have to call on them to do it, and we have to admonish them to do it. And one of the things that most people don't understand is that between 1998 and 2001, when we did the big National Press Club event that hundreds of millions of people saw, by the way, around the world, and now there are 14 countries that have opened up their UFO files, and it launched the global disclosure movement. But before that, we carefully went to the heads of every agency and members of Congress and chairmen of committees and the White House and the CIA director and the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, and we gave them everything we had. And we also asked them, please fix this problem. Now, when they didn't, we then wrote a letter. And this letter, most people have never heard about. It's called a UNOD letter, unless otherwise directed. And it's a military ruse that an advisor told me to use. And the way it works is really clever. You basically send a letter and it says, unless otherwise directed by this date, our assessment is the following, and we're going to do the following unless you tell us otherwise. Now, what was in this letter? Well, it's in our books. You can get them on SiriusDisclosure.com. There's nothing secret about this. Most people just haven't understood what it meant. This letter went to the heads of every agency and every branch of government: FBI, NSA, CIA, Justice Department, blah, blah, White House, Congress. And basically what it said was, we have gathered this intelligence. We have X numbers of top secret witnesses and documents. Our assessment is because we have briefed a sitting CIA director, the head of intelligence joint staff, the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, chairman of key oversight committees of the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives, and all of them have been lied to and denied access to this information. These projects, these unacknowledged special access projects, a priori, are illegal, criminal, and not protected by the National Security Act or the rule of law. And we are going to move forward with this information with immunity.
Beyond 3D.
And so I want to correct you. We were not asking for immunity. we declared it up front. And I had a constitutional lawyer that I ran this by, Daniel Sheehan, who many of you know, who did the Silkwood case and the Pentagon Papers. And I discussed that with him and also with some other eminent constitutional attorneys in the United States. They said, you're absolutely right. If you can prove, and we can, that people at this level of government were being denied access to and deliberately deceived and lied to about these projects, those projects have gone off the reservation of our Constitution and are themselves criminal activities. Therefore, even if someone signed a national security oath, that oath has no binding enforcement because the entity and the compartmentalized project they signed it for is itself illegal. And it's just like if you have a criminal organization or the mafia and you enter into a contract with them, that contract is non-binding. This is basic law. So we analyzed this very carefully, and we sent this, unless otherwise directed, letter to all the chief people, return, receipt, requested. So we proved that it was received. And we gave them a timeline. And that timeline passed. And that's why we did the disclosure project. I will also point out that an admiral, the head of intelligence joint staff, turned to me and he said, and I was sitting there with the astronaut Edgar Mitchell, and this admiral at the Pentagon, this was a stand-up briefing I did at the Pentagon, which I'm happy to do them as a public service. At the end of it, I was asking that he help fix this problem. And he looked at me, he says, Dr. Greer, I've come to learn that there are unacknowledged projects that have saucer-shaped and other shaped UFOs that we've been building that can do circles around my B-2 stealth bomber, which is the best thing I know about and have access to and have been briefed on. He says, how am I going to take them on? And it was a very chilling moment. It was very similar to when the CIA director said, how do we disclose that which we don't have any access control over? And then I said to him, you know, we do need your help. He says, I can't do anything without my civilian, the Secretary of Defense and the President ordering me to. Or I will also be in breach of the chain of command, which is the whole problem. So it's a catch-22. And then he turned to me, he says, as far as I'm concerned, given how criminally illegal these projects are being run, if you have the ability to get anything you have out to the public, do it, and you have my blessing. So one person once asked me, and it was an Army intelligence guy, he says, who the hell do you think you are releasing this kind of information to the public? And I said, well, first of all, I'm a free denizen of the universe and a conscious being. Secondly, I'm a citizen of the United States that I consider very patriotic to expose this kind of criminal activity. Thirdly, my mother's family were some of the original founders of the United States. We were the first prisoner of war with the British, tragically. We were such losers, we got caught right away. Anyway, and then I said, and the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff told me that if we can bring this information out, do it. So I got the blessing from him, and I have witnesses to this event. And he just looked at me, he says, oh my God. So there's a backstory to disclosure that the public doesn't know. People just see whatever caricatures are out there on idiot forums like I don't know what. But it's been a lot of work, but we did it very, very carefully. We were not reckless about this. We gave the governments every opportunity. And so at this point, I feel we don't owe the system another bite at that apple. If they want to do it, great. But I think it's a huge mistake for anyone listening to this to think that the change that we require to survive as a planet is going to happen at the hands of anyone but those in your room right now and listening to this around the world. I honestly believe we have to be that force of good change and make that good future happen. So I wanted to talk a little bit, people want to update on this little creature. If you go to SiriusDisclosure.com, you'll see in the film Sirius. And by the way, those of you who contributed to that film, it was funded by the public, what we call crowdfunding. Thank you. very much. I mean, it's really been an enormous success and has really brought a lot of new people into understanding in all walks of life. I know when we did the premiere. By the way, we want to do a premiere in Australia. If y'all want to set it up, we'll do something in Australia with Sirius. Should we do that? You want to do that?
Absolutely.
All right. Well, anyway, we will. I got to work out the details quickly. I'm flying into, I don't know, Sydney or someplace. But one of the things that I found when I was in LA at that premiere, which had 2 huge theaters, it was 1,200 people, a day or two before the premiere, she had a wonderful party for us at her home and a private screening in her own theater of Sirius. And it was fascinating to me. There were people from all walks of life there, not just the film industry and actors and producers, but technology people. And most of those folks had no idea that any of this could possibly be true. And when they saw this little creature, and I had with me there the geneticist from Stanford University, who unfortunately has been greatly misinterpreted in what he's been saying about this, but he, of course, has to say very, very conservative things in the public. He's a professor at Stanford, which is, you know, a major Ivy League university here in America. And they said, well, what do you think this is? And I said, well, after 9 months of analysis, we still have no idea. And there was sort of a stunned silence because everyone expects you're going to drive through the McDonald's of science and order up a kiddie meal, and it's going to be instant conclusions. That's what the media and the UFO community want. The truth about science is that it's much more difficult. And if you go to SiriusDisclosure.com, there is a new report that's up there and also a link to a YouTube, about a 14-minute video update that I've done. But I want to share some of the new information we found about this. Number one, the key thing to understand about this little body is that it's a 6 to 8 year old child. Now, initially, the genetic team thought it was a male, and that's what they reported out. It has since come in that they don't know if it has a gender or what the gender is, which is sort of interesting. The genetic material was pulled out of the ribs, the right, well, I'm not going to take my shirt off, but the right anterior ribs on this small humanoid, and clipped them. And inside the rib, there was excellent bone marrow. So we were able to extract a really good sample. So at that point, we did it in a forensic way under sterile conditions, et cetera, and so on. And this is partially shown in the film Sirius. We then had the genetics lab begin to do specialized tests on what's called old DNA, because this is a creature that's been dead for, we don't know, 100 to 1,000 years. Nobody knows quite yet when it lived. We weren't able to take big pieces of it to do proper carbon dating. We're hoping we can do it through what's called a genetic clock, where you can actually estimate the age by seeing how many changes in the genome has happened just by aging with the cytosine. I don't want to get too technical, I'll put everyone to sleep, falling off, but it's called a genetic clock. So that's work to be done. We may get a better estimate. I think it's probably between 100 and 200 years old. And it was found in the Atacama desert of Chile, which is northern Chile. It's the driest desert in the world.
Beyond 3D.
You know, you begin to go, well, when we got the report from Dr. Ralph Lockman, now, who is the world's expert, not just the Stanford expert, the world's expert on skeletal abnormalities. And he looked at this thing, and he looked at the x-rays and the CAT scans that we did in Barcelona. And by the way, all of those were done according to his specifications. He requested exactly which images, angles, blah, blah to get, because he knew what he needed to see. And I'm an emergency doctor, and, you know, I deal with acute, life-threatening and fractures and things of this sort. This man, Dr. Lockman, is the world's expert who literally wrote the textbook on skeletal abnormalities, genetic defects, all that sort of thing in children. So he looked at them, and he looked at the growth plates, what are called the epiphyseal plates in the legs, but also in the other joints. And it is consistent with a 6 to 8 year old human. Now, it's only 6 inches. It's a 13 centimeter creature, 100 to 200 years ago or more. How did it live in one of the harshest places in the world with being only 6 inches long if it was human, in the sense that we say human? Now, to confuse the issue further, it turns out that it only has 10 ribs. Well, there's no syndrome known in the literature where humans, fetuses, defected embryos of any kind have 10 ribs. Then it turns out that it has a lot of other abnormalities, a very large cranium, about 3 times the size of ours from the eyes upward, so relative facial hypoplasia, meaning the face is smaller compared to the rest of the head. And it most certainly is not an embryo or a fetus. It's not a fetus, even though someone in Spain claimed it was, because they hadn't done the scientific. They just looked at it and said, oh, well, this is the size of a 15 to 18-year-old human fetus that's deformed. It is not, because you can look at the bones in x-rays and compare them with known standards of bone density. And even the radiologist, the head of the clinic, was a huge radiological center in Barcelona, who owned this clinic, and she was chief of radiology. She came down into the CAT scan room and was looking at the images and at the x-rays, and she says, my God. She says, what is this thing? Because it is most certainly several years old. So this is not just one man's opinion. And so then you get into the question is, all right, what is the genetic? Now, if you'll bear with me for about 5 minutes, if I'm putting you to sleep, well, it's 10 o'clock for me, so it's early for you. You can deal with it. You need to know a little science. When you run a genetic test, let's say if I gave some of my blood or something, and they ran it, it's fresh. Okay, so what they do is they run it against the database, which has about 2,500 ethnic groups, racial groups, areas of the world in the database that have been studied, about 2,500 genomes. Okay, because there's variation from race and region and type and da-da. And then there are certain genes that have been mapped for certain diseases, whether it's, the trisomies, like Down syndrome and what have you. And those will begin to light up. It was to take the genetic material. It was such high quality, they didn't have to do a lot of PCR replication, which is polymerase chain reaction. In other words, it didn't have to go through a lot of magnification where you could get a lot of error in the read. It was a very pure, high quality, dense sample of rich genetic material. So Dr. Nolan was able to have 3 of the most prestigious labs in the world run it. When they ran it, most important of which is that none of the genes that control for dwarfism, which of course if this is a 6 to 8 year old and it's 6 inches long, that's there's no known dwarf syndrome that small. There were none of those genes that were abnormal. Number 2, the gene for progeria, which is when you have advanced bone aging, which could explain the bones looking older than they are, but it was actually much younger. That gene was normal. Then, most astonishingly, notwithstanding the high quality of the sample, 9% of, which is 2 million base pairs of the genetic material didn't match human. Now, of the stuff that was in the genome, it showed a 99% match to humans. But it depends on how you count. It's either 91 or 99. Because, in other words, a lot of the material that did match for human genes. But there's 9% that's not matching, unmatched. Now, if it were a core sample, or if you were just running this with a known human or a known chimpanzee or something, you would say, oh, well, that was a computer error, what have you, except it came from 3 separate places, the same number. The automated computerized run on the genetic material is done by computers and algorithms. And everyone knows with computers, garbage in, garbage out. There is no genetic database of ETs outside of covert programs at the CIA and elsewhere. So, and they do have that, but we don't have access. Stanford doesn't have access to this. I certainly don't have a lab full of, well, here's this creature from this star system's genes. So how are you going to match it? Well, again, a chimpanzee is 97% identical to us. What if this 9% unmatched, let's say half of it, is junk DNA and error? That would still give you 4 or 5% that is an operative gene. What operative gene means? A gene that does something. And that would make this particular creature more different from us than we are from chimps. So how are we going to get to the bottom of this? What we're hoping to do, and I hope to have some news about this in the next couple of months. By the time I come to Australia, maybe we will, is to do a multi-center trial where we put all this data and let MIT and other major top drawer universities around the world drill down on these 2 million base pairs, which could represent as many as 1,000 or 2,000 genes, and see if they can figure out what, if anything, they do. So how long will that take? We don't know. The Human Genome Project took 10 years and several $billion. We're doing this with no budget. Remember, this is Dr. Nolan did this just on his own time and resources from his lab. He's the head of a huge lab at Stanford University. He has something like 30 or 40 PhDs that work under him. Dr. Lockman did the studies without any payment. My whole team and I have done all this without any compensation. So at a certain point, however, when you have no research funds and you're trying to drill down on something this extraordinary, it's a little bit pathetic because, you know, you'll see the Smithsonian or National Geographic spend $5 million on an expedition to get one picture of the giant squid off the coast of New Zealand. And we can't get any funding to do something of this importance. So this is how crazy the world is. The point I'm making is that we're going to do what we can, but there are no answers on the genetics yet. And people who have written, I know the Huffington Post and some of the UFO tabloid things have said, oh, they figured out it's a deformed human. They have not. Nobody knows what this creature is. And one other thing I want to point out, I'm more of a clinician. I'm not a geneticist. I'm a medical doctor, which means we actually put our hands on and do things with people. And I have delivered a number of deformed infants. And in fact, I delivered an anencephalic baby, one that has basically no head. And it lived a few hours and died. And I have delivered premature infants, but nothing this small. There is not a neonatal intensive care unit anywhere in the world that can keep something this small alive to where it would have lived for 6 to 7 years. Because if it was 6 to 8 years of age and it's only 6 inches when it died, what was its size at birth?
Beyond 3D.
So you begin to ask these questions clinically, where the clinical picture doesn't add up. The science is there. It's been proven that this is a 6 to 8 year old. It's been proven that it is a legitimate non-hoax organism. The CAT scan, which, by the way, you can go to SiriusDisclosure.com and you can click on and see the 3D CAT scan. It's all there for people to see. There's nothing hidden here I'm talking about. Dr. Lockman's report is very clear that a 6 to 8 year old, he says human. Now, when these scientists at Stanford say it's human, they have to say it's human. What else are they going to say it is? They certainly are not going to say, oh, it's an ET, because that also can't be proven. And so I think that what we have to do is say, now what? Well, it turns out that since all this came out in the last 2 months, or a little less, there has been an enormous number of contacts that we've made in Chile, Puerto Rico, Russia, and other places where apparently creatures that look very similar to this one have been found. And one may still be in someone's private possession in Santiago that we're trying to run down. That's actually only 3 inches large, but looks very, very similar, or maybe identical. Now, the geneticists and the team at Stanford said, look, if there's more than one of these, that is virtually case closed, because this, since there are no known syndromes in the world that match this, if there are 2 of them from different times, this begins to be something where it's incredibly, almost infinitesimally unlikely that it's just a human genetic deformation, that something else is going on. But then I'll have people say, look, what about the B2A allele? Now, I'll bore you a little bit more. There are alleles or markers that will give certain geographic regions, and there's one called the B, like boy, 2A allele. That allele is associated with women. It's in the mitochondrial DNA, female, of that part of Chile. And so if that is true, now it has to be checked by hand. This is what lit up from this quick computerized run. The question is, how did that get in there? Well, I told the team at Stanford, maybe it's the wrong question. What if the B2A allele got into the human genome from ETs? What if the ancient drawings, the Nazca lines, the petroglyphs, all the information about ancient people having contact with the children from the stars, that they are star children, and that our ancestors came from the stars? My grandmother was Cherokee. My dad was a half Cherokee, and I'm a quarter Cherokee Indian, which is a tribe in North Carolina where I grew up. And I look more Dutch and Scottish, but their tradition was that they came from the Pleiades, and that their ancestors in the stars were from the Pleiades. And even Shenandoah, the word, all of you have heard of Shenandoah National Park. My farm out in the country in Virginia overlooks Shenandoah National Park and the Blue Ridge Mountains. Shenandoah means daughter of the stars, or daughter from the stars. And you find this is true in tribal societies in Africa and all over the world. So and even Celtic traditions and Gaelic. So the question becomes, which came first? Because if 15,000, 30,000, 50,000, 200,000 years ago, contact had happened that resulted in modern Homo sapiens, then we're dealing with a totally different picture. And now, of course, I'm leaving the reports of Dr. Lockman and Dr. Nolan behind, to be clear, and putting on my hat as someone who knows that ETs are real and who's studied this subject since I was a child for 40-some years. What I think is that, in fact, there is a missing link that does not get explained purely by evolution, and that there has been contact over the millions of years between Earth and these other civilizations. And that, moreover, that our genetic material, and more importantly, our epigenetic programming, can turn on and off genes that can express that. Now, what do I mean by that? The big thing in genetics right now is called epigenetics, which is basically chemical, environmental, neurotransmitter, and other stimulants, let's call them, that will turn on and off genes that used to be considered junk DNA. So we had, 30,000 genes, and everything else was considered junk, which was the majority of it. Now they're finding out that junk DNA is encoded with all kinds of information that, for example, when you sit in a meditative state and go into samadhi, you can actually turn on and off genes that facilitate that the next time around. There's some amazing neuroscience going on. So the question becomes, what is really hidden in the double helix spiral, this vortex known as our DNA? What is really in there? I think it's really exciting, and I think this is where the mystery is. But again, these are only my opinions. I'm not trying to reflect the opinions of the Stanford folks, although in private I've had a lot of discussions with some senior scientists, not just at Stanford, but in other institutes here in Washington, who really believe what I just said. And so, we're really stepping into exciting territory here, in my opinion, because I think that we're going to discover at some point. Now, I think the orthodox fundamentalist religious people won't like this, but that we are children from the stars, that we all have a connection to these other civilizations, and maybe there is something to this ancient concept of panspermia, that in fact life is propagated through the cosmos and has been for billions of years. And it was interesting because the geneticists at Stanford sent me a report that was done by a group of people looking into just computerized study of genetic material. And they said, based on current evolutionary knowledge, our genetic material is 10 billion years old, but the Earth is only 4.5 billion years old. There's a link to this on our website in the report. It'll blow your mind when you read it. And the question then becomes, if the origins and the development of our genome predates even the existence of our solar system, there's something very interesting that I think is going to get revealed in the coming years and decades. But I think everyone who has an interest in the subject needs to just explore it for themselves. But what I'd ask people to do is to do it with an unprejudiced mind and a pure heart. My big concern about this is that there is so much fear-mongering, which I don't think is helpful. I think that if we're, as Einstein said, no problem has ever been solved by the consciousness that created it. My own view of this is that we are entering into a new cycle. This yuga was a 450,000 year cycle, or yuga is closing. It's closed. We're in this very confusing time of the emergence of a 500,000 year cycle, the hallmark of which is not world peace, but universal peace, where we're going to have peace on this planet. These advanced, wondrous technologies, the elimination of poverty would take place in one generation. And then on that foundation of justice and peace, we can then go into higher states of consciousness and travel amongst the stars as an enlightened people. I think that's the destiny of the human race. And I think that's what we have to manifest. It will not happen by itself. It's not going to happen by some potentate at the Vatican or in the White House down the road here. It's going to happen with all of us coming together and doing it. And that's what I hope folks will join with us and do. And if we're lucky, I hope I can see many of you when I come to Australia soon.
Beyond 3D.
Welcome back tonight to Beyond 3D. That's all we have time for this week. Be sure to check out our Facebook page, which is Beyond, the number 3, the hyphen, and the letter D. Both Matt and I will be back in Studio 2 together next week, so do be sure to return, where we would love the pleasure of your company. That's all we have time for tonight, and thank you for joining our show. Happy 10th birthday, Alex. Good night, everyone.
Just because you haven't experienced it doesn't mean it doesn't exist.